Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony, and today I want to talk to you about one of the most interesting, one of the most amazing beer styles in all of beer history, and that is the Bavarian Helles Lager. I know that when you think about the Helles Lager, you don't think, it's anything too special. It's like a standard light to gold quaffing beer, something that you drink, but you don't really think too much of. But what if I was to tell you that the Helles Lager is actually the culmination of hundreds of years of technological advancement and innovation within the brewing industry? It is the peak. It is the pinnacle of what brewing can be. You might not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. Now, I know that might be hard for some people to hear because when they think like the most well-crafted beers, they think of something super fancy, something, highly designed and overproduced and everything. But I'm telling you, when you hear this story, it's going to blow your mind. So without further ado, let's get into it. You'll first notice that the Helles Lager is an incredibly beautiful beer with a tall, fluffy white head, lively carbonation dancing around in a beautiful pale yellow or golden light body, hence its name, Helles, which translates into English as pale or light. Secondly, you can oftentimes find Helles lagers with terms like hell or hell lager or whatever hell, and that's just kind of short for pale, right? The Helles sits around 4.5 to 5% ABV and usually has a 15 to 20 IBU. It boasts a clean yet full-bodied brew with the slightest touch of sweet honey malt and floral noble hop flavors. And it's this incredibly delicate profile that makes the Helles so amazing. I mean, think about it. It is almost non-flavored and how subdued it is, and what little bits you get in there are perfectly balanced. There's nothing really to hide your mistakes behind, which is what makes the Helles a little bit intimidating to brew. Every single flaw you make throughout the brewing process is going to show through huge. The Helles, to be perfect, to be brewed exactly what you expect, takes a lot of skill, takes a lot of craftsmanship, and takes a lot of dedication. That alone makes it worthy of your respect, in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about the Helles Lager's history. You might be surprised to find that the Helles Lager is actually rather young by European standards, only coming into existence around the mid-1800s. However, the story for how the Helles Lager actually came into existence started nearly 500 years earlier. So let's jump back. Now, the first little bit of foundation that we need to lay down actually is rather well known. You could make the argument that the path to the Helles Lager, that whole journey, started with the implementation of the famous or infamous Reinheitsgebot, better known to American speakers as the Bavarian Purity Law. Bavaria nowadays is kind of known as like a beacon of brewing prowess and of exceptionally well-crafted beers. That wasn't always the case. Prior to the 1500s, Bavaria was actually known as a region of bad beer, like really bad. It was kind of known for being bad. The problem stemmed from the fact that there wasn't a lot of oversight. There wasn't a lot of quality control. And on top of that, they were woefully behind in the technology department. The problem was they used a smoke-powered kiln for their malt. So every batch of beer that they brewed was going to come out smoky. In 1447, Munich actually instituted their first legislation that would try to rein in some of the brewing techniques. They were like, hey, only the finest ingredients, only the or I guess at that point in time, 3, malt, water, and hops. And we're going to make the best beers that we possibly can. And they seemed rather successful. So over the next 50 or so years, that actually got implemented across Bavaria as a whole. And only about 10 to 15 years later, they actually implemented another regulation, almost like an addendum to the Reinheitsgebot, where they were going to say, hey, you can only brew and ferment beer during the winter months. That would help them rein in that uncontrolled fermentation. It did greatly improve their fermentation practices, way less spoiled batches, but more interestingly so. it basically solidified the fact that lagers were going to be the definitive brewing style of Bavaria. However, there was still a problem. All their beers were still dark and smoky. And if you looked at some of the most famous beer styles that were making tons of money and gaining notoriety throughout Europe at this point in time, they were all pale and not smoky. That had to change. Jumping way forward in the 1820s, two famous brewers named Anton Dreher and Gabriel Sedemeier. Anton Dreher was actually from Vienna, and Gabriel Sedemeier was from Munich. And they met through a series of apprenticeships to become master brewers themselves. And they both kind of bonded over the shared idea that both of their regions were woefully behind in the times, and that they believed there was so much potential in revolutionizing and modernizing both of their respective brewing traditions. The two bros decided that they were going to actually take a little bit of a road trip throughout Europe, and they were going to visit some of the most well-known and powerful brewing regions, and they were going to learn and take on apprenticeship and figure out how they were making such good beer when, Austro-Hungary and Bavaria just were incapable of doing so. They traveled up to Berlin, they traveled through Bohemia, they traveled through the North Rhine region, and they eventually made their way to England, all along learning the techniques and the practices of making great lighter kilned beers. And they learned a lot. And they learned a lot about the newer technologies, and they were determined to bring them back with them. So when they actually did make it back, they made a series of strong implementations. First off, they brought with them the new induction hot air heated kilns, and that allowed them to both produce lighter kilned malts without that overbearing smoky touch, basically solving both problems at the same time. Later on, they would both be some of the first people to bring refrigeration into the picture, into the brewing industry, which allowed them to make well-crafted lighter lagers year-round. So over the past several hundred years, we saw a jump forward in quality. We saw a jump forward in innovation. But the one thing that lacked, the one missing piece to making the Helles lager become reality, was inspiration. In 1842, there was a small town in Bohemia who was going through a little bit of a problem. They had brewers and they had city leaders and city elders who allowed these brewers to make awful beer. We're talking spoiled batches. We're talking consistently subpar products, just awful, indrinkable. And the people were pissed. They started to riot. They started to create an uproar in the streets. And they actually chased the brewers out of town. The city elders, they decided, hey, we hear that Bavaria is actually doing some pretty cool things. They're making some lighter beers. They're making some great lagers. Let's hire a Bavarian brewer to come to our little town and revolutionize what we're doing, make our people happy, and maybe make a little bit of a side change for us if they can brew something good enough. That little town, you might have heard of it, was called Pilsen. And the beer that they ended up creating was the Pilsner, probably the most significant beer style of all time. So as you could probably guess from here, the Bohemian Pilsner went on an economic rampage. It swept throughout Europe, devastating local markets. People were turning away from their long-standing traditional beer styles and rushing towards the Pilsners with open mouths. People could not get enough of it, and it was making an absolute killing, a massive profit for the Bohemian brewers. And that really scared the Bavarian brewers. They had worked so hard for so long to create something that they would be known for, that would make them successful, that would make them a powerful brewing region. And Bohemia was just about to sweep it all away with their Pilsner. They had to make some changes, and they had to figure out a way that they could compete on an even playing field against the Pilsner. So they got to brewing. So what they decided to do was, if they couldn't beat them, they had to join them. They knew that paler, lighter beers was the way to success. I mean, they had been working towards that for almost 500 years at this point in time, but somebody kind of beat them to the punch. So they knew that to be able to compete compete with the Bohemian Pilsner, they needed to create their own special Bavarian light lager that would rival in clarity, in brightness, and in just great quality. The first couple attempts at trying to combat the Bohemian Pilsner was to actually brew their own Pilsner style in Bavaria themselves. There are several interesting results from this. One, none of them really lived for that long, maybe a year or two at best. And the idea I've seen from some of the books I've read is that they just weren't that good. And a lot of people blame it on just the water quality and the mineral content of Bavarian water. It just was not good enough to be able to really make their Pilsners pop. However, in 1894, Gabriel Stadelmeyer, the guy we talked about a little while ago, he was actually about to retire from the Spaten brewery. He decided that he was going to relinquish his authority and his power to his 3 sons, each of them a little bit of a visionary themselves. And they decided they were going to put their heads together and they were going to figure out a way that they could compete against the Pilsner. And what they actually settled on was, yes, okay, it had to be pale. Yes, it had to be high quality, it had to be a great lager. But more importantly, they decided we have to appeal specifically to the palate of the Germans. So what they decided to do, the 3 brothers, was they were going to brew a pale lager, but they were going to make it a little bit less hoppy than the Pilsner, but they were going to make it a lot more full body. They wanted something that would be a little chew to it, something that would appease Bavarian drinkers. The product that they came out with was a few shades darker than the Pilsner. However, they believed that the flavor and the body would give them a significant edge. So they brewed this first batch and they actually sent it to Hamburg, Germany, way up north. It's unknown why exactly they did that, but a couple theories I have is perhaps they didn't want the locals to try it, and if it was a failure, give them that immediate backlash. But another theory I have is possibly they were trying to beat the Pilsner in its rampage and its spread. If they could get all the way up to Hamburg, and if they were able to get their beer adopted and beloved by the Hamburgians, then they would be able to fend off the Pilsner's advance further north. And Hamburg was a strategic city. It has a lot of ports, and it had historically, as a part of the Hanseatic League, been known to ship beer throughout the rest of Europe. So if they were able to win over Hamburg, potentially they were able to win over significant chunks of the rest of the world. It was a bold strategy, and people actually seemed to like it a lot. Although the one little bit of criticism is that they wanted it to be a little bit hoppier. So in subsequent batches, they did increase the IBUs. That was like the prototype of the Helles. It became rather successful, and it was liked so much that the Spaten Brewery, the 3 brothers, were like, okay, you know what, screw it. We got these tips and tricks that we're going to try to implement and refine our recipe. We're going to finally release it in 1895 to the local Münchener drinkers. And it was pretty well received. They really knew that they were onto something when the locals were starting to clamor about it. They went on, they got an official patent for it, and the Helles was an established beer style. Things were going pretty good, but it unfortunately wouldn't last for long. And like most things in life, when things start to turn a darker tide, it's usually the closest ones that are going to come at you first. That same year, in 1895, there was a Council of Munich Brewers. Spaten, they were leading the charge. They're like, hey, look, people are turning away from the traditional Munich Dunkel. They don't like the old way of brewing. They want the Helles. They want the Pilsner. We have to compete for what customers want. But not everyone was sold on that. In fact, Joseph Wagner, the current owner of the Augustiner Brewery, he said some pretty harsh things against the Helles. He said, I take the view that the reputation of Munich brown beers has been greatly damaged by the brewing of pale beers. which has done nothing but serve as an unnecessary advertisement for Pilsners. Which, I can kind of see that argument. If Pilsners are all the rampage and you start trying to compete against it, people, might go to you, but they might see you as a bit of a knockoff. And if they have the opportunity to get the real deal, they might go for it. But I think the Helles was significantly different enough that it could be established as its own defined thing. So I don't know how much water that argument actually holds. The Siedelmeyers retorted with, Pilsner beers have become even more popular. Had we not made the Helles, a competing brewery would have, and it would have usurped that business. I believe we have not made a mistake, but have complied with the wishes of a larger portion of the population. Thus, we cannot stop making Helles beer. The council, which had largely been kind of unanimous in their decision making for a long time, left this conference in disunity. The breweries who wanted the Helles, they were like, screw you, we're going to keep brewing it anyway. The ones who were against the Helles, they were angry and they pounded their fists and said, there's no way we will ever. It's just a fad. We're not going to brew a Helles lager. And many of the breweries were kind of left with your shoulders up. They didn't know what to do. Although it seemed that the almighty dollar, or whatever their currency was in Bavaria at this point in time, it seemed that it would have the final vote, because within the next 10 to 20 years, every single one of those Munich breweries would have a Helles lager of their own. The Helles lager did exactly what it was supposed to do. It swept throughout Germany, and it created a barrier against the incursion of the Pilsner, winning over many a drinker in its wake. This is normally the part of the video where I talk about how the Helles lager beer style has developed and changed over the years. However, honestly, it really hasn't evolved in any real significant way. Unless you consider the Hellerbach or the Hellesbach, which is just a incredibly pale, light lagered Bach interpretation. You could make the argument that it does fit into both the Bach category and the Helles lager category, but I don't know. I feel like there still needs to be a little bit more exploration into its distinctions of where it really falls. Maybe I'll do a video of that in the future. It still feels like the peak of full-bodied German light lagers. However, there have been some interesting regional developments. Some sources indicate that the North Germans adopted the Helles lager and further increased its IBUs to better compete against the Pilsner. They even called it the Pils to better compete against the Bohemians. The Brewers Association book on Helles even claims that the Helles made an incursion into Bohemia, where the local Czech beers were brewed to compete against it, creating a wider category of Svetly Lezik, or just pale lagers, which included all light lagers to include the Pilsner and the Bohemian interpretations of the Helles. However, both of those last two statements do seem to be a bit of a debate. It's also been described as the originally used beer for the German Radler beer style, which was originally a Helles lager cut with lemonade. But apart from these, there really hasn't been any major advancements. All in all, the Bavarian Helles made a significant namesake for itself. This became the pinnacle of hundreds of years of innovation, of exploration, of inspiration. This was the technological peak of what Bavaria was able to do. And still to this day, it is a beer style that many brewers and homebrewers test their mettle up against to see, can I brew something that is so delicate, so fine, that any mistake I do will be glaring, bold, and in your face. This is what perfection looks like when it comes to beer brewing. So many things had to happen. So many foundational stepping stones were required in order to get here. Do you see why I say it's like an Avengers movie? There was so much required just to make this happen. And although it really hasn't changed very much in the past couple hundred years, there is a huge opportunity for it now. Lagers are probably more popular now than they have been in decades. The craft beer movement has really started kind of weaning away from some of the beer styles that kind of built it up, and there's been a huge boost to the lager industry. And the Helles is primed for a craft beer adaptation. Hoppier, stronger ABV, but not reaching into that Hellerbach area. There is a prime opportunity to create like a craft Helles or an American adaptation of the Helles, and I'm kind of excited to see what that looks like. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you learned something about the crazy history behind this beer style. Even though a lot of this story didn't pertain particularly to the Helles Lager, once it was established and once it was invented, there wasn't a whole lot of change, but there was just so much required to make it. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you were able to stick with me. So like, comment, subscribe. Remember, there is a story, or maybe like 5 or 6 different ones in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers, y'all.